Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, colleagues connecting from elsewhere, maybe in Africa. And welcome to today BBL, where we will be discussing adaptation and seeing if it is on track, and looking at the nationally determined contributions and findings from 53 countries. Before getting into the topic, maybe just as an introduction, clearly food security and climate change are two major development challenges of our time. In Africa, the food system is off track and the climate is changing profoundly. Just some numbers: in 2020, more than 1 in 5 people in Africa are faced with hunger. And this is more than double the proportion of hungry people in any other region. And about 282 million of African population are undernourished. Looking at West Africa, the region I'm covering, we have more than 27 million people needing immediate food assistance, and this is in 2021. Looking at the numbers of 2022, we are already at 28 and something millions. And this is mostly due to a combination of drought, poverty, high food import prices, environmental degradation, displacement, poor trade integration, and conflict. And the Russian-Ukraine war is worsening the situation. So adapting Africa's food system to climate change is an imperative. It's not anymore a choice. Food security declined by 5 to 20% with each flood or drought, while the region experiences about 1.4% reduction in food calories per year from key food security crops. At the same time, while agriculture exports are rising, the continent remains a net food importer at an annual cost of 43 billion. And without action, the continent's food import could reach up to 110 billion by 2025, so just by tomorrow. Current action to build resilience to climate change and related shocks across Africa's food system are promising, but not nearly enough to meet the scale of the problem. If global temperatures rise by an average of 3 degrees Celsius trajectory, as current trends suggest, disruption to current food system will be profound and catastrophic for millions who struggle to survive. Even on 1.5 degree Celsius trajectory, a more ambitious and urgent set of adaptation interventions are required to prevent wide-scale famine. So what will it take to adapt Africa's food system to climate change? Appropriate investments in the ag sector can help the food system adapt by increasing productivity, resilience, and resource use efficiency. Financing adaptation to climate change will be most cost-effective than financing increasingly frequent and severe crises, disaster relief, and recovery responses. And some recent data from the bank and also the CG systems estimated the cost of action on climate adaptation of agriculture and food system is less a tenth of the cost of inaction, around $15 billion compared to $201 billion per annum. So the World Bank and other partners are working with countries to scale up climate-smart agriculture through advisory services, policy, and lending. And we are looking for additional ways to support our clients in the development of their indices, inclusion of additional adaptation measures, and ways to support clients in reaching their adaptation goals. The presentation we will hear today starts to answer some of these big questions, namely, what does it take to close the gap in financing adaptation in agriculture? And we will start with our first speaker, leading the AICCRA program, one of the bank-financed operation. So Ana Maria Lobo Guerrero will present one of the World Bank engagement to support adaptation in agriculture. And now it's one of, I'd say, famous projects. The accelerating the impact of CGIAR, climate research for Africa, using the acronym AICCRA. So Ana Maria is the director of AICCRA. Prior to that, she led the transformation of the transforming food system under a change in climate initiative at the CGIAR SIAT Alliance for Biodiversity, which aimed to realize a transformation in food system by mobilizing knowledge and catalyzing action. Her work informed policy decisions related to the transformation of food system, focusing on the key actions that are needed to meet the targets for climate adaptation and mitigation targets, while not undermining other goals. Before joining SIAT, Ana Maria worked with the Colombian government to develop its climate change policy, climate research agenda, and low carbon growth strategies. Ana Maria holds a PhD in economics from the University of California at Los Angeles. I will introduce the second speaker later on, but the floor is yours, Ana Maria.
Thank you very much, Chakib, for that introduction. And thank you, Chakib, Katie, Ionis, and everybody that is behind this event. We are very excited and happy to have a space to present what we are doing through AICCRA and some of the results that we have been able to accomplish in the first 2 years of implementation of these projects. So as Chakib mentioned, AICCRA stands for Accelerating the Impacts of CGIAR Climate Research for Africa. If you go to the next slide, Katie, please. Why AICCRA is so important. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because Chakib already, in a very nice way, clear way, made the point of the importance of addressing these issues in relation to climate extremes, floods, droughts, especially in Africa. But the one point that I would like to emphasize is that we are not on track, especially in the African continent, in order to address the challenges in relation to climate variability and extremes. And just to put an example, the assessment that was done through the Malabo Declaration during 2021 says that just one country is on track in relation to those targets. So it's not only the magnitude of the challenge that climate change is imposing in the continent, but also the urgency to act, and therefore the importance of thinking how to move fast in terms of scaling these climate solutions. Could you go to the next slide, Katie, please? So what is AICCRA? AICCRA is a very interesting and I would say unique project among the projects that usually the CGIAR implements, because AICCRA, it's basically about the scaling. AICCRA, it's using the 50 years knowledge generation of the CGIAR in relation to climate solutions and putting it in the hands of vulnerable smallholder farmers in Africa. We work in 6 countries, what we call 6 core countries: Senegal, Ghana, Mali, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Zambia. But we also have teams that operate at the regional level, and these are fundamental for the scaling, as you are going to see in my next slide. So we have a team working in West Africa and then another team working in East and Southern Africa. And key dimensions of the work that AICCRA does in order to be able to scale these climate solutions include knowledge sharing. So you're going to see that we are doing a lot of work in terms of capacity building. Partnerships are key in terms of the scaling. They are an important component of this: innovation and gender and social inclusion. You could go to the next slide, Katie. So, but how do we do it? What's our vision for making sure that we reach the numbers with these climate solutions that we want to reach in the continent? As I just mentioned, we operate in 6 core countries, but we are really working towards what we call these spillover effects through spillover countries. What does this mean? That what we implement through AICCRA in these specific countries goes all the way up in terms of synthesis and lessons learned. So this means that in terms of scaling, what we do is synthesize lessons learned from implementation of activities in AICCRA in these 6 core countries, and then through regional African institutions such as CORAP, such as AgriMed, through their mandates, making sure that these climate solutions and lessons learned on how to scale them are reaching all the countries that are under the mandates of these regional African institutions. And if you see in the slide, it's really interesting how we have 2 arrows because they go in both directions. So all the way from the implementation of activities at the national level to the regional organizations and then to other countries, but then coming back through those regional organizations into improving the work that we are doing in these 6 core countries. We could go to the next slide. So one of the relevant indicators of the AICCRA project is to be able to reach farmers with these climate smart agriculture and climate information services solutions. The number that we had envisioned at the beginning of the project was reaching 1.5 million by the end of the 3 years of implementation of the project. We're very excited to report that by the end of the 2nd year, we have already reached nearly 3 million. But what is interesting about the project is that what we are thinking, it's really understanding and going beyond the numbers. So it's just not the numbers of beneficiaries. We want to understand what is happening with these smallholder farmers that are accessing these climate solutions. You could go to the next slide, Katie. So here are some, and this is part of what we are reporting in our 2022 annual report. It's the outcome stories behind these numbers. So what's really changing? In this slide, what you see is that for each one of the 6 countries, we are counting the number of smallholder farmers that are accessing these climate solutions. But for instance, you can see the example of Mali. So in Mali, we have been able to reach 111,000 farmers. But more important than that, we engage in a randomized control trial to understand what is happening with these people that are accessing this information. In this case, is through this Rights Advice app. And really interesting, what we are learning and observing from this exercise was that the people that are receiving this information, they have been experiencing increases in their yields for rice. And really interesting that there's a difference between women and men in terms of these increases in yields. But also what we perceived was an increase in income of $5 per hectare, and also a food consumption score increase from the people that were accessing this climate information. So this is an example of how we are trying to understand better what is happening beyond just counting the number of people that are receiving climate information and climate smart agriculture solutions. If you could go to the next slide, Katie. Other kind of changes that we are starting to observe through the implementation of the AICCRA activities. This is in relation to National African Meteorological Organization services, which we believe that are a key component in terms of scaling these climate solutions. So what we did with 5 of them was to, through our engagement and capacity building, enable the 5 of them to use and adopt this automatic weather station data tool. But this is very important because what we are observing is that this is leading to a transformation in the ability of these African organizations to access, analyze, and utilize data streams in order to tailor their climate products to specific decisions that they need to make. And these are the kind of changes that we would like to promote, because this speaks about the sustainability of the use of this information. We need to transform the way that they analyze and use information, and we were able to do this through the adoption of this tool. This is work that has been led by the International Research Institute for Climate and Society, along with many partners in these 5 African countries. If you could go to the next slide, Katie. And in here, there are some examples. I'm not going to go into detail, but how we are using or working together with regional African organizations to be able to scale and to reach more farmers with these climate solutions. So just to give you an example, AgriMed. So we have been working with the West Africa Regional Climate Center in order to include this next generation seasonal climate forecasting tool to develop dynamic forecast models. And what it is interesting about this is that now that AgriMed has the ability to use this new way of producing this climate forecasting, this is benefiting all the countries that are under the mandate of AgriMed. Another really interesting example is something that we are doing with CORAP. So with CORAP, we engage for many months into providing capacity building in-house in CORAP in relation to foresight. Because of that, they created a community of practice using these tools, using this knowledge to address how to respond better to pest and disease outbreaks driven by climate change. Again, these are the changes that we want to see. We want to see capacity in-house in CORAP to be able to address key challenges that the region is facing. You could go to the next slide. The other very exciting outcome that we have been able to track for the 2 years of implementation of AICCRA, it's in relation to leveraging money. We believe that there's an opportunity to have more resources that can enhance the impact of the operations that are happening in the African region. So we calculated, according to our system of knowledge management, that AICCRA has been able to leverage around $14.6 million in the first 2 years of implementation of the project. And in the screen, you can see the type of organizations that are contributing to advance this agenda in terms of putting resources for these kind of activities. But also, and this is another part that we are very excited about being able to contribute through AICCRA, is that by working with the World Bank, we are enhancing the impact of World Bank operations. So this is the example, for instance, of the DRY project, the de-risking, inclusion, and value enhancement of pastoral economies in the Horn of Africa. This is a $365 million project from the World Bank, and AICCRA's work in Kenya was instrumental in the design of the project. The same has happened with the FSRP, the World Bank West Africa Food Systems Resilience Program, where we, from the very beginning of the conceptualization, we use AICCRA tools, but also in terms of the implementation, working together with regional institutions such as CORAP and ECOWAS to make sure that we are enhancing the impact of these World Bank operations. Another very interesting thing that is happening, and we didn't report this under the 14.6 million of money that AICCRA has been able to leverage, but this has a very high probability of becoming reality, is this work, which came from what I mentioned in terms of this community of practice of foresight in CORAF. So through that, what we are doing right now, it's facilitating discussions for a 70 million investment for the African Development Bank in order to respond to these pest and diseases problems that are driven because of climate change. This is my last slide. Just want to emphasize that part of our theory of change in AICCRA, it's really understanding what is the best way to share knowledge, and through that to inspire action in the continent. And this is the presentation that you are going to hear from Andrea is an example of this, how we are communicating the different papers that we are producing. We have been able to produce more than 35 peer-reviewed open access papers, but these are papers that are aiming at understanding what are the successful factors for being able to scale these climate solutions. How can we help in terms of advancing the discussion for the implementation of NDCs and national adaptation plans, as Andrea is going to present in the following minutes. And finally, some few words about communications, because communications is another part of the strategy of AICCRA. And we believe that we can also support African institutions in terms of communicating better the dimension or issues in relation to climate extremes and variability. And therefore, we're putting together capacity building exercises for African organizations in order to enhance the capacity for communicating climate smart agriculture and climate information services solutions. Another very clear example of how we are working together with World Bank operations in order to use what we have learned from AICCRA, it's the work with the Agricultural Productivity Program for Southern Africa, the APSA project, and how we are engaging with them, sharing insights in relation to things that have worked, that we believe that had worked well through communications in AICCRA, and then making sure that this World Bank project can benefit from that. So with that, let me stop there. Thank you very much. And Andrea is going to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria. I can see the enthusiasm, and this is why I think also the results are being achieved on the ground. And thanks for emphasizing the fact that we are not in track and we need to act fast to address the challenges we are facing in Africa. And for that, partnership is needed, knowledge, learning, and sharing are needed, and also scale up. I think, and this is where the bank can do more by building on AICCRA and scaling up the solutions that you are developing on the ground. And so I'm really pleased to see also all the resources that you were able to leverage through AICCRA, and see also other partners like the Africa Development Bank being involved. Great to see also that number of regional institutions are having their capacity built and taking all the solutions that you are putting in place. So without further ado, let's move to our second speaker, Andrea Novak, which will present recent work by the AICCRA program to analyze adaptation measures in indices in Africa countries. So Andrea Novak is a research team lead for climate action at the Alliance of Biodiversity and CIAT, and PhD candidate at Wageningen University and Research. Her research focuses on measuring climate adaptation and resilience and in agri-food sectors in the context of national and global reporting processes such as the UNFCCC and private sector safeguards. For more than a decade, she collaborated with governments, non-governments, and private sector across private sector actors across Latin America and Africa to co-design and implement tools for prioritizing, scaling, monitoring, and evaluation of strategies, policies, and investment in climate-resilient agriculture. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can I get a confirmation from the room that you can hear me well? A thumbs up. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for having me here. And as I have been mentioned before, I'm here to talk about some recent research we've been doing under AICCRA to understand how countries approach adaptation tracking. And when I mean adaptation tracking, I mean how do they know if they are adapting, and if they are adapting in the right way to address vulnerabilities and to build resilience. And the presentation will focus on a synthesis of key results that will be published soon in a peer-reviewed paper, but also we were planning several knowledge products and engagement within regional and global discussions around adaptation tracking. And I am presenting on behalf of a team of different colleagues within the CG, but also outside. We've been collaborating with the FAO, with Agnes, the Basque Climate Change Institute, and iCatalyst, especially in the early development of the methodology for this review. Ana Maria gave a good, and the previous presentations gave a good overview of why AICCRA is there and why climate action is needed. And perhaps this slide is a bit redundant, but what I want to emphasize is that yes, climate risks are imminent, and climate action for the agriculture sector across Africa is needed urgently. And this slide actually shows one of the most consequential climate risks across the continent, drought, and its effects across the decades in the next 10 years and up to 40 years time. And what we're seeing is an increase in the duration of droughts, and what this means for the agriculture sector is basically losses for millions and millions of small-scale farmers across the continent. And I am saying climate action here because in many instances, climate action or climate adaptation may not be sufficient, and we may have to start talking about transformation and actions that go beyond just doing incremental action. And in order to be able to see if adaptations are enough, or if adaptations are adequate and are adequately responding to the risk, we also need to understand how we are adapting and if what we're doing is enough. So within AICCRA, we've been exploring frameworks, methods, and tools in which countries and different actors can understand adaptation and adaptation effectiveness across scales. And our approach to understanding adaptation effectiveness or outcomes of adaptation can be compared to this iceberg picture on the slide. And it's basically, we're interested in looking at the whole system when measuring adaptation. While we see out there many approaches that look at how much adaptation finance is going to the countries or to different geographical places, others count how many actions are being implemented. There's a lot of efforts, recent efforts, trying to understand what are the best proxies or indicators for measuring adaptations. So really focusing on what's more visible on the tip of the iceberg. But we argue that understanding adaptation and adaptation effectiveness is more than that. It's about understanding the context. Why are we adapting to? It's about developing coherent narratives and pathways to understand the types of action, but also the types of objectives and goals that these actions are contributing to. Is also about developing adequate systems and institutions in place to be able to measure and track adaptation over time. And it's also about allocating adequate finance, and not just for implementing action, but also for synthesizing, for building the evidence and synthesizing lessons learned. So our approach to adaptation tracking builds on this systems approach and on the definition of adaptation as a continuum of processes towards building climate resilience and towards diminishing climate vulnerabilities. And our understanding of adaptation tracking is basically reflective of this adaptation continuum that you can see on the left side of the screen, that is composed of different stages. Understanding the vulnerability context, so what we're adapting to, the goals and the targets, like what kind of adaptation, the actions, policies and strategies in place, so how do we adapt, and the monitoring and evaluation and learning perspective. So understanding if adaptation is effective. So this is a high-level conceptual framework that we've developed for understanding how we can measure and how we can track the effectiveness or the outcomes of different adaptation strategies, starting from understanding the vulnerability profile, towards understanding the goals and the targets, the adaptation efforts or the actions in place, and the results. And I think like two key takeaways from this figure on the right, which represents our foundational piece for the research we've been doing, is one, that indicators are embedded into this adaptation continuum. So they are developed in relation to the adaptation narratives we're creating, in relation to the goals we set, the targets we set, the objectives we set, and the actions we plan. And the second piece is about the fact that tracking progress on adaptation means tracking progress on each of these pieces. So not just tracking implementation of actions, but trying to understand how these actions relate to the objectives, how objectives might change in time, and the results of our actions. So our research were focused on studying how adaptation tracking is organized at the national levels across African countries. And we've looked at nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans that have been submitted by African countries by the end of September 2022. And from there, I mean, we developed a rigorous research protocol to guide how we extract and analyze the information for our analysis. We extracted data on climate hazards, on risks, on adaptation goals, adaptation objectives, targets, actions, indicators, and data systems in place to operationalize adaptation tracking. We've compiled them into a database that will be available open access and which contains more than 6,000 observations on each of these elements that I've mentioned. And yes, we're developing knowledge products on the state of adaptation tracking across Africa that will be shared across different spaces and with different actors. And what we're trying to understand with this review is what are the ongoing efforts at national level to track adaptation? How are countries planning to understand the consequences or the effects of different adaptation strategies, and assess entry points for improving existing systems and approaches to track adaptation? And I'm going to jump quickly into some key results from the analysis. This slide focuses on an overall picture of the analysis. It takes into account all the sectors that have been included in the NGCs and NAPs and all the countries. And what we essentially see from these two figures is that there are significant foundations for understanding if and how African countries and sectors are adapting. Most countries explicitly identify hazards and risks. Many set goals and objectives and targets and plan actions to adapt. But there are, however, many opportunities for improvement, especially when it comes to diving deeper into the types of into the indicators and data systems in place to actually operationalize this tracking. And just to give you an examples of how these different elements like objectives and actions and indicators are featured in some of these documents, you can see here the different approaches to report this information. Initially, we've been looking for theories of change and impact pathways that clearly identify actions, objectives, indicators into a narrative, into a coherent narrative. This is not always the case. These elements are reported very differently across the countries with different levels of detail. And I think the key takeaway from here is that this is also an indication of the absence of guidance for adaptation reporting, for consistent adaptation reporting, and not just at continental level, but also at global level. So these different elements are reported very differently across the continent. The next results that I'm going to present are focused on the agriculture sectors and the cross-cutting sectors. And for cross-cutting sectors, we're looking at gender, social inclusion. We're looking at governance and climate education, training, knowledge production. Our sector categorization is based on previous adaptation research, but also on the AICCRA 6. And what we're seeing on the slide is that 40 out of 53 African countries explicitly plan for agriculture and cross-cutting sectors. We have explicit objectives, adaptation objectives, actions, targets, and indicators and data systems in these countries. And what one might say is that the more, like the larger the bubble sizes of this graphic means the more, for instance, actions are being reported in the country. This can speak to the level of ambition in setting these action plans and objectives, but also is an indication of the different processes and stages in which countries are in regards to adaptation planning. Some of these countries highlighted here that have a lot of, for instance, actions or targets are or have already developed national adaptation plan sectors. And I think another key thing from this slide is that what we've seen from this analysis is that not all NDCs and NAPs map actions, objectives to a specific sector. We have seen that at least 17% of the elements that we've been able to extract from these NDCs and NAPs are actually not mapped to any sector. And this can be a good thing if we are thinking that adaptation is a process and a change that needs to cut across sectors and needs to have a more systemic approach rather than a sectoral approach. But it can also be challenging when it comes to implementing adaptation, because all the adaptation financing currently, or largely all of the adaptation financing, is going through sectoral budgets. So it has implications on how we're thinking about featuring sectors within these plans, how we plan our actions and targets, and how we track progress. And I think there's also like why we're seeing these different stages of the different countries planning to different extents objectives and actions is also because of, as I was mentioned previously, there is no harmonized guidance on how to plan or how to report on these different elements. So this is also a big reflection on the role of global processes to improve guidance to the countries in order to enhance the overall planning and tracking processes. What we're seeing on the slide is a large amount of adaptation objectives and actions mapped across the agriculture sectors and across the 40 countries that have agriculture-specific elements, but a very less than 0.5% of these objectives and actions are actually establishing clear targets. And the role of targets here is critical for being able to measure and track progress. Targets are like checkpoints against which we can measure if what we're doing is on track or not. And I'm just like including a few examples of what is a good, or what is a target, what is an element with a target, and what is an element without a target. On the slide, and I'm not gonna read them, but I think essentially here is that what we're saying is that at continental level, or at least across the countries that include agricultural adaptation objectives and actions, there is a big gap and a significant opportunity to improve target setting. We do see, if we look at country-specific insights, we do see some best practice example for target setting. We identify 1 in 3 countries that have that for every action and objective match a clear a clear target. And what types of targets are countries setting? And most of the targets are referring to time-bound targets. So set clear timeframes for action implementation or for reaching objectives, such as establishing crop and livestock insurances by 2025, or developing and promoting climate-smart agriculture practices by 2030. Less targets are actually quantitative and allow for measurement. For instance, developing a certain number of hectares of irrigated area, or number of livestock production intensification areas that are established and operational. We also identify instances where targets are both quantitative and time-bound, which are the ideal, the gold standard, I would say, for adaptation tracking. So for instance, establishing 100 farmer field schools and training 5,000 farmers by 2025. Another important piece when talking about targets is that most of the time-bound targets for agriculture and cross-cutting sectors are set for the next 10 years or so. And this speaks to the time frame of these policy documents that we're taking into account: national adaptation plans, NDCs, which are actually focused on shorter time frames, but also speaks to the necessity of developing longer-term strategies for understanding how adaptation will need to be planned, or the types of adaptation outcomes that are envisioned on the longer term. And also what we're seeing here again on the slide, what we might take away from the slide is also like the level of ambition of setting targets across different time frames. So not just focusing on one specific decade, but gradual incremental adaptation processes. One of the other important pieces for adaptation tracking that I mentioned is the indicators, and we have identified more than 250 indicators proposed for measuring adaptation in the agriculture sectors. And while this may seem not a lot if we're looking at this chart, and if we're looking at the proportion of ag-focused indicators in relation to other sectors, we believe that this is a good starting point for starting the conversation on how these indicators can actually be operationalized. We believe that this is a good foundation for other countries to learn about the types of indicators that are being suggested, but also how they will be operationalized in the future. And this slide actually shows what types of indicators are being included by countries in relation to the agriculture sector. And there's many ways to look at these different indicators, especially in a context where countries measure very different things and very different dimensions of agriculture, either social related indicators, or agriculture related, environmental related, institutional related. There's also the option to look at indicators from a monitoring perspective, from a more pragmatic perspective, which is represented here on the slide. And here we're showing that most of the measurements of agriculture adaptation progress is focused on activity implementation and immediate results. We have a large number of the countries who feature adaptation indicators in their NDCs and NAPs, measuring either results of activities, or we also call them output indicators, like agriculture risks and vulnerability systems deployed, or number of staff trained, or number of beneficiaries of different practices, and to a less extent measuring outcomes. And I mean, this is not very surprising, given that the time frame set for adaptation in the targets is short term. Outcomes take more time to take effect, and therefore we argue that this is an explanation of why we're seeing these results. But again, outcomes are very important, or outcome-based indicators are very important to understand how adaptation strategies affect systems on the longer term, and to understand if the adaptation or if the pathway we're going to is the correct one, is the desired one, or if it produces negative effect or maladaptations. We found very limited evidence of existing data systems to operationalize adaptation tracking. And when I mean data systems, it's actually clear indication of how the different indicators will be collected, who is responsible for collecting the data or reporting the data, what kind of methods will be used. But we identified more than 50% of the countries that were included in the study reporting plans or even advancements in developing national adaptation-focused M&E systems. So there is already we're going, which is interesting to follow over the next years. And yeah, my two last slides will be focused on what does it take to close the gap. We've seen a lot of, I think, a lot of foundations out there, but we've also seen a lot of gaps coming from a continental perspective, but also a country-focused perspective. But I want first to make like 4 big reflections out of the work we've done, and also the results we've been seeing coming out. One is focused on the targets, and we cannot emphasize it more, the importance of targets for adaptation tracking, for setting those benchmarks, those checkpoints. Knowing the destination is key, but tracking progress towards it is only possible if we have clear targets in mind. The other piece is about reframing the narrative on measuring and tracking adaptation, and we argue that the shortest way to identifying the perfect indicator is developing a clear narrative on why we're adapting, how we're adapting, and how do we measure this adaptation. So clear impact pathways or adaptation pathways or rationales to determine the metrics that we're using. The third reflection is on the dialogue and on the need to learn more from others' experiences, to learn more from those systems that are working, from those cases where target setting was straightforward, or was at least where target setting was possible. How did it work? But also understanding the failures of developing tracking systems, of setting adaptation tracking agendas. And the fourth message is around how we build this legacy or this knowledge on adaptation tracking, how we build the evidence that adaptation is happening, at what cost and at what benefits. And it is very important to build on the national circumstances as a way to build operational and sustainable tracking systems over time. We're seeing a lot of diversity in the types of targets and indicators that are being proposed by countries, and this is an indication of the need for context specificity of these tracking systems. And we have work coming out from other colleagues who are looking at the effectiveness of setting agendas, like tracking agendas like the SDGs, and how these different standardization processes were hindered or not by national context-specific context. And I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but just like giving an overview of our thinking of what's next with the adaptation tracking agenda. And I'm hoping that we can touch upon these things in the panel discussion. But essentially, what we think needs to happen next, given these different opportunities that we're seeing, opportunities for building better work or to strengthening existing work, and lies at 3 levels or in 3 action areas. One is the opportunity to convene actors. The second is focused on strengthening capacity, and the third one on building robust evidence. And we argue that these action areas need to happen across the levels, and they need to be an opportunity for also the different scales, like the global scale, the national scale, the local scale, to talk to each other more. Global processes to be more informed by national circumstances. Subnational capacity strengthening needs to be tied better to national priorities. Local level, local scale projects need to be informing more subnational and national priorities. So there is many, we think that there is many different ways in which actors can engage. And here is just a very, I would say, a dirty summary of our ideas, of our initial ideas, of the types of actions, the types of actors that can be engaged. This is not a definitive list, as a conversation starter, is not exhaustive, and actually invites to further reflections and ideas about how we can implement, but also how we can actually expand the network of partnerships, how we can synergize with other initiatives to move this agenda moving forward. We're arguing for agreement on how adaptation tracking will be framed at the global level under UNFCCC, but also agreement on how adaptation tracking is actually being operationalized at the local levels, the definitions we're using, the metrics we're using, and at the national level, the role of governments to learn from these 2 processes, from the global and local scales, but also to learn from other national counterparts on the on adaptation tracking. We're also arguing for better adaptation pathways, more robust adaptation pathways, and strengthening capacities to design these across levels, from the national to subnational to local, because these will be critical for informing context fit indicators. But at the global level, we need more concrete guidance on how to be developing consistent planning and reporting, particularly under the UNFCCC. And I think we cannot emphasize enough the importance of evidence. I think it's one of the critical foundation of knowing if we are adapting is like bringing evidence. So we need to bring evidence from very different sources, global synthesis. We need to enhance the evidence from the national and local levels. And we need to be starting tools that are already existing, combining them to develop and strengthen that that knowledge base that we have on adaptation. And I think I'm going to stop here, and I'm very ready for questions and comments, and ready to go back to some of the slides if I went too quickly through some of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. This is a very enlightening presentation, and trying to give insights from Africa clearly is an important topic, and understanding if we're really doing what's needed in terms of adaptation in Africa, and especially for agriculture, is important. In fact, even when looking at the World Bank project, sometimes when I see that we contributing in terms of 40–60% of our investment on climate co-benefits, it's in the document, but the framework to measure that and how to really have the solid evidence, I keep telling my colleagues we need to get that solid evidence there. So having a solid framework for tracking adaptation, having also solid indicators. I think you mentioned some 250 indicators. For me, this is too much. We need to get some few, 10 solid indicators that we can embed in our operations. And also on all our decision meeting, we keep discussing these indicators. And of course, we have some proposed that can help us move forward, that will be great, and having a common method of really measuring what we are doing, so we can have that solid evidence that you mentioned. But I really thanks for the excellent presentation. That was great. And without further ado, we would like to call on our colleagues for their reflections on the two presentations. And let me start with Aramtol. Aram?
Can you hear me? Let me also put my video. Thank you very much. It's really good to see our old CCAF's colleagues. Good to see Anna Maria, and I see connected as well some of the others. So AICCRA being the new name of it. Really excellent presentations from colleagues. Wonderful, most of all, to see the breadth of CSA expertise, experiences, practices that have been scaled up by AICCRA. My reflections focused on how can we achieve even more scale, because I think the title of this BBL is really quite thought-provoking. Are we doing enough? So I think the obvious answer is no, we're definitely not doing enough. I'm reporting from Burundi, which is where the country I cover particularly. And what we see here, mostly on today being International Women's Day, is that rural women are not implementing many of these CSA practices. So from the demand side and from the bottom-up perspective, there's still a long way to go. And I think that's something that AICCRA, of course, in its own creation, is set up to help absorb. Maybe just a few impact channels that I would like to add for the consideration of our colleagues at AICCRA. You've mentioned all the excellent work with the National Med Services. So I truly believe that there's a future in ensuring that these working groups on Met and agriculture, ag and the user interface platform, basically. And I know colleagues on the ground will understand that wording, but making sure that the Met Service folks work with the Ministry of Agriculture folks, that's really important. It's a missing bridge. It impedes the ability of ministry people to understand what future climate will mean as they develop the extension service, training programs, as they do more of the research on the ground. So I think enhanced capacity strengthening for national systems is absolutely fundamental if we are to achieve the level of impact and the level of scale that we want to be reaching with programs linking research and policy action. I think World Bank programs, obviously, as Jan was mentioning earlier, are a fantastic vehicle for impact. I'm really delighted to see some of the World Bank operations you've already influenced, including the West Africa one you've mentioned previously. It'd be fantastic to see all World Bank programs benefiting from these indicators and this for frontier research that you're coming up with, both on the CSA practices themselves. I know the bank, and I'm thinking of our colleague Ademola, who's led over the past few years good practice lessons on how to do good CSA on the ground. So I think more of those would be really beneficial for bank TTLs as more climate change gets on the agenda and more CSA gets implemented in programs, not just led by agriculture, but really across the spectrum of climate resilience investment in the bank. So I think more good practice lessons is one conduit. Another one, of course, would be actual support as teams go on and design these programs. And I mentioned I'm reflecting from the prism of Burundi. So there we see that women living on these very hilly slopes of the countryside are really faced with the need for improved access to extension services because their plants are ravaged by pests. Increased and intensifying rainfall events create these massive landslides, then they lose crops, and it's really a very dire situation of land degradation added on to climate impact. So in settings as Burundi's, where rural women are putting their own cash, up to 50% of their own meager budgets, family budgets to pay out of pocket for climate resilient services, how does CSA help? How do we ensure that what we now know from the past 20 years of good practice, climate smart agriculture, can percolate into bank programs that are supporting women such as the women of Burundi that I have in mind as I'm reflecting on your presentation. So can we do more? Definitely. I think AICCRA is showing the way for how to do more. And I truly believe that accentuating impact through ensuring that bridge between MET and agriculture services really is strengthened in every single country that she covers an important impact pathway. And the second one is really targeting the ag ministries themselves, because that's the lasting capacity that countries will work with when AICCRA is done and when the bank leaves. And it's absolutely fundamental that they breathe and live CSA, and not just in theoretical terms, but actually embedded in programs that are financed by the bank and other development partners. I'll leave it as that. Back to the audience, and happy to come in later if time allows. Thanks again for a terrific presentation.
Thank you so much for your reflections. And let me move to Johannes from reflections from someone leading the agenda on climate change from the AICCRA. So Johannes.
Thank you, Shakib, and thanks to all the presenters, Anna and Andrea. It was fascinating to first learn what AICCRA has achieved even more at this stage, but also from Andrea where things are standing in terms of adaptation in Africa. So maybe I'll take just 1 minute to reflect on some key challenges that I think Andrea pointed out in her presentation, and then try to summarize at high level what we do in the bank and in agriculture to address those challenges. So maybe one thing I would like to comment on the evolution of climate risk assessments from, and we have seen a tremendous evolution over the last few years from very qualitative way to assess risks to more quantitative way. And this is a very important thing. We all know that we need numbers when we assess climate risks and impacts, and this is important for both for investors, private investors and MDBs, but also for project developers, meaning MDBs and clients. And there is obviously a lack of data. For example, in the bank, we have been developing a resilience rating system for our investment projects, and we see it is difficult to quantify risks and impacts, and but also there is an issue of mainstreaming tools, and Sakib pointed out to this as well. It's very important what AICCRA is doing. Anna mentioned that you have been working in situ with the organizations like CORAF and others to build this capacity. Unless those tools are mainstreamed in the organizations, they remain of very limited use. My second point is on the definitions of adaptation versus resilience. I think many of our colleagues will use those two terms interchangeably, whereas there are some important differences. Adaptation, at least from my side, is more action-oriented. However, resilience comes from a systems perspective, and although resilience perhaps is what we aspire to, however, it's very difficult to approach and achieve within the small cycles that we work on. from a bank perspective, which is a project, which is usually for about 5 years of implementation. However, in the bank, we have been working to develop resilience impact pathways and menu of indicators. And that has been proved useful to at least integrate some of those bundled indicators as part of the results frameworks in order to, especially on the outcome side. And Andrea pointed out to the usefulness of outcome-oriented indicators to become part of the results frameworks of investment operations. Then the last thing that I would like to point out is some of the key numbers that Andrea summarized in terms of NDCs and adaptation in Africa. Obviously, it's a concern that although it seems that the majority of the countries, they do account for adaptation and in agriculture per se. However, there is a lack of targets and even more indicators. So I think, especially now with the new generation of NDCs, it is the right time to work on that side. Yeah, maybe I'll jump now to, back in November, many of us, we were in the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, and as the audience, I'm pretty sure they're aware with the parties, they have now agreed on a new decision, which comes after 5 years or even more years from the Coronivia decision. And this is called the Joint Work on Implementation of Climate Action on Agriculture and Food Security. And I think one of the key elements there is how parties are able to document progress on climate change adaptation and mitigation. And many of the things that we discussed today, they are of very practical relevance to this. Maybe just 1 minute of what we are doing specifically in the bank and in agriculture to address some of those challenges. We have been working with many partners and CGIAR centers and CIAT as well to develop analytics. You are familiar with the CSA profiles, the CSA investment plans, and now we are trying to expand the work along the value chains on a new business line, which is going to be called farm to fork diagnostics. So we try to address adaptation along the value chain and not just at the production level, which has been usually the story so far. Another thing, the bank has been developing new analytics to combine climate and development objectives, and these are called the country climate change development reports. There is a plan to roll out those reports in the next 4 years for all the countries. Right now, I believe about 25 of those reports are being finalized or they're out. And, one of the things that they're pretty innovative about these reports is really the, linking the climate change adaptation and mitigation goals with the impact of climate risks to poverty, distributional effects, and other standard kind of more traditional development objectives, but also to try to identify policy priorities and investments that they have to happen in certain countries. And finally, add cost and numbers related to cost to adaptation actions that we're talking about here. A last thing that the bank, together with other MDBs, are in the process of rolling out is the Paris alignment of investment operations. In the case of the World Bank, we expect all our operations to be assessed for Paris alignment starting next fiscal year, meaning July 2013. One of the first screening questions that the MDBs have agreed on is to take stock of the NDCs and other national strategies of the countries and assess to what extent on the adaptation side, to what extent climate risks, they have a material impact on the project development objectives of the investment operation. That said, I think many of the work that AICCRA is doing is extremely important to help organizations such as the World Bank to make use of the NDCs in this assessment project, assessment of investment operations. And with that all, I would like to thank you all for the contributions, and over to Sakib. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johannes, for highlighting some of the work of the bank and also for your reflections. And we'll go to Katie Freeman for her own reflections. Katie.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Ana Maria and to Andrea for the great presentations. Happy International Women's Day to everybody. I think it's very fitting to have this event today. Women globally, and particularly in Africa, are among the most vulnerable to climate change and at the greatest need of adaptation and adaptation strategies. So they are also among those with an opportunity to contribute to the work for adaptation. And AICCRA is doing a lot of work. The AICCRA program that Ana Maria described is doing a lot of work with women across Africa to adopt climate smart agriculture technologies and climate smart information services. So I wanted to build just briefly on something that Ana Maria said related to AICCRA support to World Bank operations. So I talk a lot about the Food Systems Resilience Program, this World Bank operation in West Africa that will, as of next September, support 8 different countries and also 3 regional organizations. And AICCRA is helping the regional organizations, as Ana Maria mentioned, build capacity, helping the national institutions build capacity, but really addressing a missing middle. How can we take validated climate smart agriculture technology and translate to action? How do we take science and turn it into investment? And that is what AICCRA is supporting the FSRP to do, this Food Systems Resilience Program. And it's a role that AICCRA is playing with World Bank operations across the continent, helping to validate in a scientific and rigorous way climate smart agriculture technologies that can then be put into the hands of the government and poised for scale. When we're listening to Andrea talk, we're talking about tracking how do we know that something is working and what are we doing? And we also need the what, right? The substance of what are we actually going to do? In addition to tracking it, who is providing these rigorous, scientifically proven climate smart agriculture technologies to World Bank projects and to governments? And this is part of the role that AICCRA is playing with the Food Systems Resilience Program and has the potential to play in more places in Africa. One thing that Andrea mentioned that I thought was very interesting is that adaptation financing is primarily going through sectoral budgets, and that 17% of the actions that they identified are actually uncategorized. Essentially, if we sort of make the link there, that 17% of these don't really have a targeted budget. No one is really financing them. So it's clear from the perspective of the World Bank that we need to be working with line ministries by sector to encourage and inform the way that they are investing, but we also need to be working across ministries. And Andrea's presentation pointed to the need for harmonization across countries, but also globally. Our programs across the globe aim to support adaptation, and I've worked with some countries that carefully track their activities across the sector and aggregate. So I work a lot and I talk a lot about Uruguay, which is a small country with 3.5 million people, where they are easily able to count and then aggregate what they're doing for adaptation in their sector. But other countries, most of them that we work with in West Africa and many of them that we work with across Africa, need more support to be able to do that. They don't just do it themselves. So there are many disaggregated programs happening across the sector that are not being counted or measured towards progress towards the NDC. And AICCRA and the research that Andrea is doing also has a role to play in this. I noted something that Shakib also mentioned, that 250 indicators to measure how to adapt to climate is too many, right? And that countries, if we're talking about Paris alignment and we're talking about measuring countries' contributions towards adaptation in a global and harmonized way, we won't be able to, you can't count what you don't measure, right? We will not be able to harmonize these if there are 250 different things, and what do they all mean? And there are different definitions of them. So there's also the need globally to create the type of structure that Andrea discussed today, and to inform global institutions who are working on this, the UNFCCC, right? To be able to have a harmonized way that countries are working towards tracking adaptation in their NDCs and then actually implementing them. Finally, just to say that we, as Andrea said, need to bring evidence to know if we are adapting, that we can't use these 250 indicators in an arbitrary way in different countries. It doesn't, at the end of the day, it doesn't mean a lot, right? And in the context of the World Bank in the region, I think we have a role to play in knowing what we're doing and what's working. And I think AICCRA has a role to play in helping to support that at a global level and at a World Bank level, to know what we're doing, and specifically through the scientific research and technology validation and research like one Andrea presented today, to know what's working. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Katie, also for reminding us of the International Women's Day. So congratulations, ladies. Okay, thanks again to Ana Maria and also Andrea, and also the discussant for all their views and also reflections on where we stand and also the way forward. Let me open the floor to the participant in this meeting, and please just maybe raise your hand or take the floor and ask questions to Andrea or Ana Maria, or also the discussion, so we can have kind of an animated discussion. So anyone who wants to come in, also from the table here? Okay, maybe you can do it. And so we have questions on the chat, and Katie will maybe take the.
And Claudia has her hand up.
Okay,
so
let's start then with Claudia, and then go to the questions that were put on the chat. Claudia?
Hi, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Very nice presentations indeed. I learned quite a bit about adaptation. I was wondering, I don't know that much about the AICCRA project, but I was wondering if you also work on mitigation, because if you like collecting all the data on adaptation and adaptation tracking, and given that adaptation mitigation is mostly connected in most of the NDCs, I was just wondering if you address that, and if you do, how.
Anyone else? Maybe we can take a second question, and then we move to the. Okay, please. Maybe just introduce yourself and then.
Yeah, Andrea, thanks for the presentation. Ana Maria, thanks for the presentation. I'm Evan Gervetz from the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT, and also leading Theme 2 under AICCRA. And so I was wondering, Andrea, in particular, if you could talk a bit more about measuring and tracking adaptation for the private sector. That it seems a lot of this is about sort of really the bank operations and government investments, et cetera. But I think we know that the private sector is going to play a big role in addressing the climate challenges and adaptation in particular. And so I think there's various ways that this can come in. I mean, you have sort of the larger corporates on the one hand, cooperatives and this type of thing, and then we go down to the SMEs that are really the engine of rural development and probably need to play a big role in adaptation. So wondering how you see this coming into these systems and how we can be tracking that as part of an overall strategy.
Very good. So maybe you can summarize some of the questions, then we get it back to.
Sure. So a few of the questions from the chat. How can we engage the broader public in African countries on the ambitions of the NDCs to ultimately encourage the process? There's one. What could the role of the World Bank in its operations be to be useful in tracking adaptation tracking as well as tracking adaptation effectiveness? And then a third is, how do we balance the trade-offs between the need for localized challenges and interventions versus a limited number of indicators?
Very good. Thank you. So let's start with Andrea, and then we come back to you. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you so much for the questions. Very interesting ones, and some of them are more challenging than others. But I'll try to address them in the order that they have been asked. One was about mitigation and whether we were looking at mitigation actions in the NDCs. We're not particularly focused. This is an adaptation-focused research, but some of the actions that are included in the NDCs particularly are included as actions that have mitigation co-benefits, or the other way around. There's already some research synthesizing how mitigation is being featured in NDCs, or how the agriculture sector is being featured in NDCs from a mitigation perspectives, both within the CG, but also other institutions like the WRI with the climate action tracker. So there's already a lot of analysis around that. On the private sector piece, I think this is a very important discussion point. And while I have talked about NDCs and support to public policy development under a global framework, we believe that this way of thinking about the necessity of building impact pathways and context fit, or indicators to match the impact pathway, very much apply to private sector investments who implement different investments and different strategies on the field. And under the AICCRA program, we've already started engaging at a lower level with the private sector, with SMEs, supporting them in the development of these impact pathways, trying to build capacity on how they could measure their impact in relation to climate smart agriculture, in relation to adaptation and to mitigation in a meaningful way. And when I'm talking about meaningful, it means in a way that is operational, but also makes sense within the larger adaptation narrative that they are suggesting. So again, I think that this impact pathway or adaptation pathway language comes quite often in our approach to understand tracking and to operationalize tracking. And I think this answer also kind of covers a bit the question on how to balance between the localized challenges and interventions and the limited number of indicators, or the large number of indicators as we've seen, and the large diversity. And I think again, I may be redundant, but I think that the focus, I mean, we should not be stuck into this indicator issue too much. I think we should be focusing on building a robust narrative and then trying to match adequate indicators to that robust narrative. Yes, we need a tool set. We need to understand what types of indicators work for what types of impact pathways. But I think the number of indicators is actually is not the highest priority on the agenda. And there was a question about how to engage the general public in the NDC ambition, raising NDC ambition. I'm not very familiar with this. I mean, with how the general public is defined by the person who asked the question, but I would assume it is referring to a wider participation of different sectors and different actors, civil society, private sector actors at different levels, decision makers at different levels in a country. And I think this will be key. Their engagement in defining these ambitions will be key, and especially when it comes to setting more robust targets, becoming more visible on the adaptation agenda, on these ambitions and these targets. I don't know if I covered everything, but I hope I have.
Perfect. Thanks.
I'll let if she wants to intervene. Thanks.
No, thanks. I think you covered most of the questions, and then you have Anna Maria that will, if anything that was missed, she will do it.
Thank you very much, Chakib and Andrea. Yeah, I think that you cover most of them. Perhaps some few things for me to add in relation to that last question that you were referring for increasing the ambition in relation to NDCs and adaptation efforts. So just to highlight that perhaps two key things that we are doing through AICCRA. The first one is that we are hosting these capacity building programs for partners in communications and in media to better understand how to report on climate change and on climate smart agriculture. We believe that media and in general communications are powerful in order to make the point of why this is a very important topic, why it is important to track what is going on, and through these different ways of engaging with different type of audiences, making sure that this is high in the agenda. And the second key thing that I would like to highlight in relation to this, it's universities. That's another thing that we are doing through AICCRA. Was one of the key outcome stories. I didn't go through that, but we have been engaging with Roof Forum, which is a group of universities in Africa, making sure that we are including these concepts on climate smart agriculture and climate information services in curriculum. And we believe that this has the huge potential in terms of the future generation. So students that are starting to think about what they are going to do, what are their ambitions, what is relevant in terms of their activities in Africa, really making sure that they understand what's at stake and why this is a very important topic to consider and to learn about. And perhaps just to add about the question in relation to mitigation. So as you know, AICCRA addresses scaling climate smart agriculture. Climate smart agriculture has three pillars: productivity, adaptation, and mitigation. So in that sense, many of the tools that we use for prioritization consider how these different technologies, practices that Katie was mentioning that are backed up by evidence, what's the result in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or capturing carbon. So in that way, we are considering the mitigation angle, but more as a co-benefit. So we want to make sure and to understand, once that we are implementing a specific technology, what is the repercussion of that in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And we have been quantifying, for instance, in terms of different use of fertilizers and or conservation agriculture and things like that, trying to understand what is the implication in terms of mitigation. But as Andrea mentioned, the focus in AICCRA, it's really understanding and assessing and scaling technologies and bundles of things, because we include these technologies with the information that are needed to respond better to these climate variability and extremes.
Very good. Thank you so much. I think we are just doing perfectly on time, with just maybe one more minute, maybe for any final comments from the participants, or if not, I will then try to wrap up and then thank everyone on this. So any final? No, I don't see any hands. So let me thank again the speakers and the participants and the discussion for attending this meeting. I think it was a very good discussion, reminding us again of the urgency to act fast. Then there is quite a lot to do, reminding us also of the importance of AICCRA, and I hope we can keep developing further this program to reach more farmers and also promote more science-based research and reaching the farmers. I think Andrea highlighted very key elements in terms of the need of a framework for tracking what we are doing in terms of adaptation. I'm on indicators. I would say that we need these indicators because I see it in our investment operation. We truly need some key indicators that we can measure efficiently and have a common method that can provide the evidence that needed to see how these investment operations are impacting the adaptation. So thanks again, and this is one BBL. Hopefully that we can continue in the future this discussion. Important for our farmers, but also important for future generation. With this, thanks again, and bye bye.